From childhood, we perceive history as an exact science of past events. Ancient Egypt, Babylon, Rome, the empire of Alexander the Great and Charlemagne, the Middle Ages and the Reformation. Scientific books, museum exhibitions, historical novels and films convince us that almost everything is known about these and other epochs. And historians will definitely have an answer prepared for almost any question from an inquisitive mind. Well, there are still gaps in history, but they are not fundamental in nature, and as new research progresses, they will gradually fill up and eventually disappear completely. However, if we take a closer look at our past, we will find many oddities and inconsistencies. Why did, say, painters of the Middle Ages, who were usually very attentive to historical details, portray biblical and ancient characters as their contemporaries? How could ancient warriors cut their enemies with bronze swords, if there was no bronze in those days? And where did iron weapons come from in ancient Egypt? Why are so few monuments of the early Middle Ages preserved, and so many of much more ancient antiquity? After all, logically it should be the other way around. And on what basis did Ivan the Terrible call himself a direct descendant of the Roman Emperor Augustus? It seems that these and many other mysteries should have prompted historians to study our past more closely. But this has not yet happened, so the question naturally arises: do we really know our history? So, what is history and what is chronology? History is the factual account of the past, allocated across a timeline. And chronology is the very timeline. Its upper point is the present day, and its lower point is the period when people began to record events happening to them. Note that the traditional version of history, which is now generally considered to be the only true one, did not always exist. Until the 16th century, there was no continuous chronology. At best, people could date events 100 or 150 years ago. Everything from further in the past was lost in the darkness of time, and legends and traditions were passed down through the years with great distortion. Therefore, it became necessary to compile a coherent and consistent picture of the most important events of human civilization, starting from antiquity, from scattered chronicles. It is believed that the foundations of chronology were laid by Eusebius Pamphilus, also known as Eusebius of Caesarea, in the 4th century AD during the era of the Roman Emperor Constantine. Unfortunately, it is not possible to become acquainted with his chronicle in full today. The original exists only in fragments, and everything else is a free rendition of St. Jerome in Latin. In the 14th century, a church historian and monk of Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, Nicephorus Callistus, attempted to write a new history of the first 3 centuries, yet failed to say anything new. He simply repeated what was written by Eusebius Pamphilus. Whereas today's chronology was created and practically completed in the fundamental works of the chronologists of the 16th and 17th centuries, historian and philosopher Joseph Scaliger and theologian Jesuit Dionysius Petavius, it is their version of history that we still study today. What was the Petavius-Scaliger version of the chronology based on? Firstly, it was based on the interpretation of numerical information collected in the Bible, as well as on astronomical calculations. However, at that time these were extremely inaccurate and contained many errors, sometimes for hundreds or even thousands of years. This is how some basic dates came into being, upon which the entire chronology was then built. For example, the day of the creation of the world, the exact date of which theologians have debated for centuries.
The dates of the creation of the world are a very interesting topic that we have analyzed. It turned out that from the 15th to the 16th centuries, there were many different versions of the date of creation of the world. The question is not scholarly, since in many chronicles this date was used as a starting point for dating events. What year the texts fall, that is, the events described by Titus Livius, Herodotus, or Thucydides, depends on where we place the date of the creation of the world. It was discovered that in the Middle Ages there were roughly 20 variations, and the wide range of different opinions regarding when the creation of the world occurred spans 3,000 years. Consequently, when dating the chronicles, which are based on this method of counting years, there are fluctuations, discrepancies of up to 3,000 years. This is a huge amount.
And one more important starting point, on which the famous history of Titus Livius is built. This is the year Rome was founded. But there are so many contradictions in the Roman chronology that it is impossible to even give a century, let alone the year in which the city was founded. According to the generally accepted version, Rome was founded in the 8th century BC by twin brothers Romulus and Remus, who were suckled by the Capitoline she-wolf, a symbol of this city. But there is another version, according to which Rome was founded by Aeneas and Odysseus, and was named after the Trojan women Roma. By the way, in Latin, Rome is spelled Roma. If this is so, then the foundation of Rome took place after the Trojan War, in which both Aeneas and Odysseus participated. That is, not in the 8th BC, but in the 13th century BC. It turns out that either Rome was founded 500 years earlier or the Trojan War took place 500 years later. How do these versions match up? However, the history of Greece, Egypt, and Western Europe is also based upon Rome's chronology. Consequently, a change in the Roman chronology necessitates a change in the history of all involved nations. And one more circumstance. Modern man is accustomed to calculating dates from the start of the Common Era, or from the birth of Christ, which occurred 2,000 years ago. However, it was not always like this. It is believed that the Roman monk Denis the Little was the first to calculate the date of birth of Christ in the 6th century AD, more than 500 years after the event itself. Due to constant disputes about the accuracy of this date, the use of Anno Domini in documents of the papacy began only in 1431. Let us set aside the various methods of determining this date and consider the most prominent detail that accompanied the birth of the Savior, the Star of Bethlehem. Now when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea in the days of Herod the king, behold, there came wise men from the east to Jerusalem, saying, "Where is he that is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and are come to worship him." The star, which they saw in the east, went before them, till it came and stood over where the young child was. According to all astronomical signs, the Gospels describe an explosion of a supernova which resulted in the formation of the Crab Nebula in the constellation Taurus. It wasn't until the 20th century that scientists figured out that this supernova had exploded between 1110 and 1170 AD. But 2,000 years ago, nothing like that could have happened in space. In general, chronology is not a simple art. One should know different ways of recording dates, compare old calendars, and be able to analyze old eclipses. Medieval chronologists were just beginning to learn this art.
For example, many chronologists from the 14th to the 16th centuries dated events according to the equinox. A solar equinox is a very precise event. It is very difficult to establish exactly when daytime equals nighttime without measuring instruments. However, an error of 1 day equals to a chronological error of approximately 100 years. If a chronicler made a mistake by 5 days, and there are examples of such mistakes in the chronicles of the 15th century, then he was mistaken by 500 to 600 years.
The Scaligerian chronology was built on such inaccurate calculations, and as a result the world history generally accepted today bears these errors. In essence, the world history is built on written texts and annals. But real events could be reflected in them in different manners. Take the discrepancy in the date for Rome's founding as an example. It might be that different sources refer to the same person using different names. Often, chronicles are accounts of events written many years or even centuries later. If we read that Genghis Khan conquered half the world in a certain year, this does not mean that it was written by an eyewitness of the events.
In addition, words and names could change their meaning.
For example, texts used to often be written without vowels. And some types of writing, such as Arabic, did not have vowels at all. Naturally, over time, unmarked vowels were forgotten, confused, and replaced by other vowels. Then an historian read the chronicle and saw the abbreviation PRS. What is it? Persia. Maybe.
Or maybe Paris?
Or even Prussia? Or Naples, or the New City, which is mentioned in ancient chronicles as both Naples in Italy, and Carthage, which also means New City. And there was also Naples in Palestine, Scythian Naples, not to mention Russian Novgorod. If the chronicle does not provide any additional information, it is very difficult to understand what kind of Naples we are talking about. Or, for example, names. Somewhere in the text, a certain Charles is mentioned. In English, this is Charles. In French, it is different, Charles. And in Spanish, his name is Carlos. So, who are we talking about? Are we discussing an English commander, a French courtier, or a Spanish grandee? For accurate dating, correct interpretation of ancient texts is of great importance, though it is not always the case. For example, many lists of Egyptian pharaohs have been preserved, containing merely names, without listing dates and accomplishments. Moreover, there is no certainty that all of them were pharaohs, and not high-ranking dignitaries. From these names, Egyptologists constructed countless dynasties, with approximately established terms of government averaging 3 pharaohs per century. That is, Egyptologists simply agreed to consider them all as pharaohs, and each one ruled for exactly 33 years. Here is a purportedly scientific approach.
And in general, this attitude towards chronology has survived to this day. Today, historians mainly work on tables created by someone else, without double-checking them or understanding anything or knowing how these numbers got into these tables at all. However, on the other hand, they know that with such a number they can provide material for a politician to make a speech, and find something suitable for textbooks and for a scientific article. That is, they delve into these tables just to make their current fantasies seem more scientific.
However, despite the fact that most of the texts on the history of Egypt that have come down to us are written in Greek, they at least exist. But as for the history of India, there are no documents at all that could be dated unequivocally. There are simply legends, folk tales, and a very small amount of documentary evidence. To recreate the history of ancient India, we are largely reliant on the reports of Greek geographers or Arab travelers, who often could not even pinpoint where exactly India was located. They confused it with Africa, and even Italy. But this did not stop the Scaligerian chronology from labeling the history of India as one of the oldest on Earth. Another reason for the chronological inaccuracies is the different ways of abbreviating dates. For example, the 3rd century from the Nativity of Christ could simply be referred to as the 3rd century from Christ and written as X3, where X is the first letter of the word Christ. In the Middle Ages, the letter X was the most commonly used anagram of the name Christ. Accordingly, the 1st century was designated as X1, the 2nd as X2, and so on. Perhaps from these abbreviations the designations of centuries that we use today appeared. However, later medieval chronologists began to interpret the letter X as the Roman numeral 10. Such an interpretation automatically adds 1,000 years to the original date, and the 3rd century immediately turns into the 13th. Another abbreviated form of the name of Jesus Christ could be the Latin letter I, the first letter of the name Jesus. It turns out that the date we consider to be 1300 today could originally mean I-300. That is, 300 from the birth of Jesus, or simply 300 AD. A good example is the printer's device of Lodewijk Elsevier, allegedly dated 1595. This example is interesting because the date is written in both Arabic and Roman numerals. The date 1524 on the engraving by Albrecht Dürer is also indicative. We see that the first letter is not only separated by a dot from the remaining numbers, but is also quite clearly written as a Latin I, with a dot, in other words, as the first letter of the name Jesus. It is precisely in this way that an incorrect interpretation of the annals led to a change in the centuries-old history of peoples. On paper, of course. But these are the written sources by which we study world history.
Medieval maps deserve special attention.
We are accustomed to maps showing east on the right, west on the left, north at the top, and south at the bottom. But it wasn't always like that. Many medieval maps were reversed, with west on the right and east on the left. This is exactly what the nautical charts from the Pietro Visconti Atlas, dating from the 14th century, look like. For example, a map of the Black Sea. The north is at the bottom, the south is at the top, and the Crimean Peninsula is depicted upside down. Here is a map of the Mediterranean Sea, east on the left, west on the right. Maps of Spain and Africa.
Africa is at the top, Spain is at the bottom.
And here are the inverted maps of England and France.
France is on the left, England is on the right.
There are a lot of interesting things on old maps that do not correspond to the traditional version of history. First, medieval geography was very unstable, and different cities could have the same name. And thus the modern bindings of historical events to certain geographical names. They are often far from being correct, since they correspond to modern ideas of historians about where, when, what, and how it was called. But if we open the maps, we will see a completely different picture.
Here is a map from the 1771 Encyclopaedia Britannica. It is evident that the Russian Empire is represented here as several different countries. The largest is Moscow Tartaria, with its capital in Tobolsk. Moreover, its area is 3 times larger than Russia's, with its capital in St. Petersburg. Then there is the independent Tartaria with its capital in Samarkand, and the Chinese Tartaria with its capital in Xinyang. It is unlikely that this information can be considered fiction or forgery, since Britannica was the pinnacle of encyclopedic knowledge at that time. Why, then, is nothing known about these states today? And, in general, where does the name Tartaria come from on the maps of the 18th century? If, according to the official version of history, the Mongol Tatar yoke had not existed for 300 years at that time.
Modern historians are reluctant to discuss these and 1,000 other oddities and mysteries of their interpretation of history. You may notice that in museums, as long as you ask for standard, simple things, they answer you with pleasure. But any questions about dates or this type of oddity are annoying, even for tour guides, not to mention the employees of these museums.
Today, museums, art galleries, and private collections hold many artifacts that supposedly serve as evidence of the generally accepted version of human history. For example, many bronze items are traditionally attributed to the Bronze Age. However, for some reason, historians are not embarrassed by the fact that bronze could not be made in the Bronze Age. Because bronze is an alloy of copper and tin was discovered only in the Middle Ages. Well, since bronze couldn't appear before tin, a legitimate question arises. How and, most importantly, when were these products made? How can be explained the presence of iron objects found in the Pyramid of Cheops in ancient Egypt? Historians stubbornly postulate that it was a meteorite that fell from the sky. Certainly, ferruginous meteorites could be found from time to time in ancient Egypt. However, studies carried out in the 20th century showed that this iron was most likely obtained industrially.
Similar finds were discovered in the tomb of Tutankhamun. On the mummy of the pharaoh, who is alleged to have lived in the 14th century BC, there were gold and iron daggers.
Well, another mystery among many others. It is known that glass is an amorphous material that crystallizes and becomes cloudy in 5 to 6 centuries. Therefore, the famous stained glass windows of the old Reims Cathedral in France are dying. How, then, can we explain why glass vessels that historians assure were made 5, 10, and even 15 centuries ago have not lost their original appearance? Is there a secret to this, or could it be that the age of these vessels has been somewhat exaggerated? Much can be explained in this case.
I think the history lacks logic. In general, today it is necessary to teach not only history but also many other social sciences using logic. You know, in the old school, back in the first half of the 20th century, there was even a subject called logic. Unfortunately, today it doesn't exist. I would revive it. I would try to ensure that logic still contributes to history and not be trampled on.
There are many things that historians do not like to talk about because they clearly contradict the accepted history and chronology.
Let's take, for example, such a common plot in medieval paintings as Golgotha and the Passion of Jesus.
How did the artists depict this event? It turns out that they were convinced that Palestine was covered with lush vegetation and that Jerusalem was located on the banks of a full-flowing river or a large strait. This is the Cathedral of St. Lorenz in Nuremberg. One of the paintings depicts the removal of the Savior from the cross. Look, the wide, blue river and the hills are clearly visible. This is the Cathedral of the city of Aachen. In this picture, large, branchy trees, a strait, or a wide river are also clearly visible. But after all, there is neither one nor the other in Jerusalem. However, on this canvas there is another interesting detail. Next to the cross is a man wearing a fur hat with ear flaps. By the way, a character dressed similarly can also be seen in one of Albrecht Dürer's engravings depicting Christ's way of the cross. The person is also wearing a large ear flap and a warm sheepskin coat. In what climate was Jerusalem located according to medieval artists? This is Sweden. Museum of the Uppsala University. On this canvas, the way of the cross of Christ is depicted somewhat unusually. As you can see, the riders are wearing turbans, and the flagpoles are crowned with crescents. The soldiers have shields on their backs. On one of them, crescents are drawn, and on the other, a cross, moreover, an orthodox one. Another interesting feature often found in medieval paintings. Often, medieval artists depicted Old Testament and ancient characters as if they were their contemporaries. Here is an engraving from the 15th century Florentine Chronicle. Here, the biblical Joshua, who lived long before the birth of Christ, is depicted as a typical medieval knight. On the towers of ancient Jericho, which Joshua is assaulting, Christian crosses are visible. Here is the icon of the Annunciation. The Holy Virgin is depicted in a typically medieval setting amongst books that did not exist during her lifetime. This is a Bible from the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz. As you can see, the medieval illustrator armed the Old Testament army with cannons that were quite modern for his time. In the painting by Lucas Cranach the Elder, the Judgment of Paris, the hero, who lived in the 13th century BC, is depicted in medieval armor. And such examples are countless. Historians call this a medieval anachronism. In their opinion, in the Middle Ages, all concepts and eras were mixed up for some reason, and the artists were deeply ignorant. However, there are similar examples in the literature of that time. For example, Petrarch seriously argued against the validity of the privileges granted to the Austrian House of Habsburg by Caesar himself. It seems there is nothing to prove here. The forgery is obvious. Indeed, according to their generally accepted chronology, the Habsburgs and Caesar are separated by 1,000 years. Why wasn't this obvious to Petrarch, one of the greatest minds of the Renaissance? There is something to ponder.
Historians do not even understand very clearly what history is. They do not have clear definitions. The past that was has gone, and today it is available to us only in some sort of memories and artifacts, and the history that stands on the bookshelves today, written by historians, that is something that can be read, admired, resented, or scolded. These are two entirely different things, and historians do not understand that.
Это две совершенно разные вещи, и историки этого не понимают.
And another problem, which is not customary to talk about, is the falsification of documents. Sadly, but it is true that not all ancient artifacts are authentic. As a rule, fakes are introduced into life subtly. If the fraud was not exposed during one generation, it would turn into the original for posterity. For example, one of the most scandalous falsifications in recent times. This is a forgery of frescoes in the Hospital of the Holy Spirit and in the Church of St. Mary in the German city of Lübeck. Due to the bombings in 1942, part of the plaster in the church collapsed. Underneath it, a painting from the 13th century was revealed. After the war in 1948, they decided to restore the frescoes, inviting a certain Dietrich Fay to do so, who, by the way, had already been brought to trial for falsifying works of art. And he recruited an assistant, Lothar Malskit, who was also a major specialist in fakes. After the restoration was completed, Fay and Malskit announced that they had succeeded in discovering the ancient painting on the walls of the church choirs, hidden beneath later layers. After 3 years of work, on the occasion of the 700th anniversary of the city, the grand opening of the restored church took place. In honor of such an event, a postage stamp was even issued. Probably, these frescoes would still be considered ancient if the city authorities were to reward both restorers for their work. However, only Dietrich Fay received the cross and Malskit received nothing. He was very offended and publicly admitted that, at Fay's request, he had knocked down frescoes from the 13th century and painted new ones based on surviving photographs. A special commission examined the frescoes and declared that Malskit was lying.
When the virtuoso restorer asked the members of the commission to take a closer look at the faces of the saints, the commission gasped in awe.
The saints had the faces of Genghis Khan, Rasputin, Marlene Dietrich, and even Malskat's own sister. The scandal grew, and the commission discovered other masterpieces of the restorers, in particular false frescoes in the Church of St. Catherine in Lübeck. By the way, it turned out that Malskit did not even knock down the old plaster but wrote on it directly.
Subsequently, it was not possible to restore the painting from the 13th century. The frescoes have irrevocably perished with time.
It is appropriate here to ask how much one can trust the statements regarding the antiquity of certain wall paintings. If the frescoes in Lübeck perished in 500 years, what then of the dating of other frescoes purported to be even older? How many more fakes are still being considered authentic? Most Russian and Western historians are sure that the Slavs are one of the youngest ethnic groups on Earth, and in the time of Caesar or Alexander the Great, the Slavs walked in animal skins. Here one should remember the Etruscans. It is believed that the Etruscans lived on the territory of Rome even before its founding, and they were the ones who cast the statue of the Capitoline she-wolf from bronze, demonstrating by the way their skill in metalworking. And what a surprise! Leaving behind a multitude of written monuments, beautiful artifacts, statues, and well-fortified cities such as Capua, Florence, and Bologna, the Etruscans suddenly disappeared into obscurity. As for the remaining texts, generations of scientists are said to be struggling with them and are unable to master them in any way. In Italy, there is even a saying Etruscan non legatur, which translates as, Etruscan is not read. But even more surprisingly, in Russia, they learned to read Etruscan back in the 19th century thanks to Fadej Valansky, who suggested that the Etruscan language was close to Slavic and even compiled the Etruscan alphabet. There is nothing surprising. It turned out that the Etruscan letters correspond to the Cyrillic alphabet by a third. If we use the Valansky alphabet, then the supposedly unreadable inscriptions do not even need to be translated.
Judge for yourself. Here is the original Etruscan text.
Воля дає, може, що за ні мілегчає.
And here is the unmistakable translation. I set him free, perhaps that is what my dear desires. This means that the Etruscan language can be considered a variant of the Slavic language, which arose and spread even before the founding of Rome. This leads to put it mildly, a revision of the entire history of mankind. And at the same time, a revision of traditional views on the Slavs themselves who, during the heyday of great European civilizations, were said to have lived in the outskirts of Europe and did not play any role in world history. Because, when in Europe universities were being founded, Russia had been under the rule of the Mongol Tatars.
We were told that a horde of wild nomads supposedly came out of the dusty desert steppes and stony deserts in Mongolia, traveled thousands of kilometers, reached Russia, conquered a powerful state, swept further, conquered some countries in Western Europe, traveled even further, entered Egypt and planted the Mameluke dynasty there. Then it mysteriously disappeared, leaving only a certain Mongol Empire. It is unclear by whom and how it was cemented.
The 300-year empire of Genghis Khan left behind no annals or state papers in the Mongolian language. Maybe all the documents from that era have been lost? No. There were letters from the Grand Dukes, last will and testaments, and church documents, but only in Russian. How did they rule? They ruled, but left nothing behind. Maybe the Russian scientist Lev Gumilyov was right in his argument that the theory of the Mongol Tatar yoke in Russia was created in the 18th century under the influence of ideas about the supposedly slave origin of Russians. The authors of this idea, Miller and Schlosser, who were foreigners, were simply fulfilling a certain political order. And one more mystery of Russian history remains. Why did Afanasy Nikitin write his book, A Journey Beyond the Three Seas, partially in Arabic although it is intended for the Russian reader? And these are not quotes from Arabic authors. The narration smoothly transitions between Russian and Arabic. It turns out that in Russia at that time they spoke two languages. Otherwise, for whom is it written? This version is also confirmed by the Arabic inscriptions on Old Russian weapons. Today, it is generally accepted that these weapons were purportedly made in Turkey, Persia, and other Muslim countries. But then why did Russian gunsmiths decorate weapons with Arabic inscriptions, even in the era of the first Romanovs, that is, as late as in the 17th century? And moreover, the royal weapons, which are still stored in the Kremlin armory today?
Or take the damask helmet of Tsar Mikhail Fedorovich.
Around the tip of the helmet is a belt of arabesques, Arabic sayings. One of them sounds like this,
Fabashir al-Muminin,
which translates as, please the believers. Many mysteries are associated with the Russian czars. For example, it is generally accepted that during the time of Ivan the Terrible, Russia was a weak state and had little influence on its neighbors. Here is an interesting fact. To this day, letters from Ivan the Terrible to European monarchs are kept in European museums, the tone of which is astonishing. Here, for example, is the letter of Ivan the Terrible to King Gustav I of Sweden, the original of which is kept in the Swedish archives. You, a peasant race, and not Gasudarsky. When the governors of Novgorod, the great emperor, the Russian Tsar would send its ambassador to King Gustav, the Gustav, king of Sweden, and the Gotha will have before it the ambassador to kiss the cross. The fact alone, it is impossible that you refer to us past governors. That is, Ivan the Terrible does not consider the Swedish king his equal at all. Read on. And we granted King Arts Magnus the city of Polchev and other cities. So with God's will, we are free in our fiefdom. Whom we want, we favor. It turns out that Ivan the Terrible considered Europe his fiefdom, and the local monarchs were vassals who did not even have the right to contact him directly, but only through intermediaries. He explained it this way. We descend from Augustus Caesar. However, this may be an exception, since Gustav I was not a hereditary king, but an elected one. Then here is another letter from Ivan the Terrible, addressed to another European monarch, Elizabeth I of the Tudor dynasty. It is kept in the archives in London. Here, Tsar Ivan respectfully refers to himself as we, and refers to the Queen of England condescendingly with a you. At the end of the letter, he even calls her a mere, common, maiden. Historians explain such a dismissive tone with Ivan the Terrible's mental illness. Why then did European monarchs recognize him as a member of aristocracy? And could Ivan the Terrible really be a descendant of Augustus, considering they are separated by 1,500 years? Or is it still much less? Here's another example. One of the national treasures of France is the old Slavonic Bible, Rant's Gospel, which Princess Anna Yaroslavna, daughter of Yaroslav the Wise, brought as a gift to her husband Henry I. For centuries, this Bible has been used at the coronation of French kings. Why did the Slavonic Bible become a much valued possession of Catholic kings?
Moreover, Henry first personally met the bride at the border.
For the French monarch, this marriage was much more honorable than for the Russian princess. That is a legitimate question. Is it possible that, for several centuries, even the best minds of their time did not notice the numerous absurdities in history? Well, of course they did. Each new generation of scientists experienced difficulty reconciling many chronological data with the version of Scaliger Petavius. Isaac Newton. At the beginning of the 18th century, relying on natural scientific ideas, Isaac Newton subjected Scaligerian chronology to a strong transformation. In general, Newton's chronology is much shorter than the one accepted today. Most events dated earlier than Alexander the Great were moved up the timeline, towards rejuvenation. This revision of the Scaligerian chronology is not as radical as the works of later scholars. But Newton correctly understood which direction the chronology should be changed in.
Although he did not advance beyond the beginning of the Common Era, he believed that, starting from the 4th century AD, the chronology was reliable.
Jean Hardouin. The director of the French Royal Library, professor of theology Jean Hardouin, argued back in 1690 that most of the ancient works were fakes written by monks in the 13th century. Hardouin was an indisputable authority not only in theology, but also in archaeology, philology, and many other sciences. In the middle of the 18th century, Lomonosov spoke out against the new version of Russian history which the Germans Miller and Baer were creating before his eyes. He harshly criticized Miller's newly published dissertation on the origin of the Russian name and people, and he gave a devastating description to Baer's works on Russian history. It seems to me that he looks a lot like some idol priest who, having fumigated himself with henbane and opium, gives dubious, obscure, inscrutable, utterly bizarre responses. Thus began the struggle for Russian history.
Роберт Балдауф.
The 19th-century German philologist Robert Baldauf explored the ancient poetry of Homer, Sophocles, and Aristotle and found that the style of their works resembled the manner of medieval troubadours and that Horace's Latin was influenced by Italian and German languages. Baldauf came to the conclusion that all these ancient writers were actually Italian Renaissance humanists.
Theodor Mommsen.
The German historian of the 19th century, Theodor Mommsen, was one of the leading representatives of the scientific direction known as hypercriticism. Mommsen wrote about obvious discrepancies in Roman chronology. He drew attention to the fact that there is a discrepancy of 500 years in the dating of such an important event as the founding of Rome.
Николай Морозов.
The life of Nikolai Alexandrovich Morozov was not easy. At age 20, Morozov became a member of the People's Will, political organization and left-wing terrorist group. In 1881, he was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Schlisselburg fortress. There he independently studied chemistry, physics, astronomy, mathematics, and history. He was released in 1905 after having been imprisoned for almost 25 years. After his release, he engaged in active scientific and scientific pedagogical activity, and after the October Revolution he became the director of the Leskaft Institute of Natural Science. He put forward and partially substantiated the fundamental hypothesis that the Scaligerian chronology of antiquity is artificially lengthened and should be revised up to the 6th century AD. This hypothesis is based on the repetitions he uncovered. What does it mean? Morozov suggested that in different historical texts, the same events are dated by different years. This could have happened due to the transcription or translation of texts by different chroniclers, thus leading to the same event being perceived as completely different, unrelated facts. They were dated and placed on the chronological axis independently of each other, resulting in duplicates or phantom reflections of real historical periods being formed in the chronology. In the annals of different centuries, strikingly similar biographies of dynasties and rulers appear. For example, Octavian Augustus and Constantine I Augustus the Great. Both come from humble families. Brave warriors are noted by previous emperors, Caesar and Diocletian, for their intelligence and courage. Both had co-rulers, which led to wars in which both won and became sole rulers. Many more coincidences follow, including the deaths of both, who suddenly fell ill and died on the road. Such similarities can be seen in other pairs of emperors. But is it really so important to know the true history? What, in essence, is the difference for the modern dweller if Rome was founded 500 years earlier or 500 years later? When did the Peloponnesian War and hundreds of other wars take place? What does all this have to do with his daily life, with its problems and worries? Will the new history make him happier, more successful, or richer?
Chronology is, from our point of view, the backbone of the history. If it turns out that this backbone does not work, have no sufficient strength, then the entire framework of history will collapse. That is why historians are so afraid of our critique of chronology.
There have been many examples in history when political decisions and, I would say, very responsible political decisions, which led to disastrous results, were made on the basis of historical considerations. It really happened and happened many times.
Chronology underlies the construction of history as a whole. What dates will be, this will be the version of history. But not just one version of history. Dating determines our views on culture, language, the history of civilization, and how humanity has generally developed. Changing dates affects all of this drastically. Many facts of the present and the epochs close to us before the 19th century receive new illumination when we accurately imagine what the correct history was like before the 17th century.
How do historians determine historical dates? How do they construct this very timeline? What methods do they use to do so? Is it possible to test their effectiveness? Our next film, What the History is Based on, will explore this.